The sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across our kitchen. Jake was bustling around, preparing for another long day at the office. I watched him, a sense of emptiness creeping in. His focus was on his laptop, and I felt invisible, lost in the mundane routine of our lives. Just as I was about to pour myself a cup of coffee, a knock on the door broke my reverie. It was Ryan, my neighbor. Since his divorce, he'd become a familiar face, our casual chats turning into a comforting ritual. "Hey, I was wondering if you wanted to grab a coffee at mine?" he asked, a hint of something deeper in his voice. I hesitated, feeling the weight of my marriage pressing down on me. "Sure, why not?" I replied, trying to sound casual, but my heart raced. As I crossed the threshold into his apartment, the air changed. It was charged, electric, almost intoxicating. I could feel the tension between us as he poured the coffee, the steam rising like the heat blooming in my chest. "You know, it's nice to have someone to talk to," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. There was a softness there, a vulnerability that made my breath hitch. Suddenly, I was overwhelmed with a mix of desire and guilt. I shouldn't be here, sharing this moment with him. But his smile, the way it lit up his face, made it hard to think straight. As our hands brushed when we reached for the same cup, a spark ignited between us. I pulled back, but the moment lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken words and what-ifs. What was happening to me? Why did it feel so right, yet so wrong? The sun was shining brilliantly in Seattle that morning, casting a warm glow through our kitchen window as I watched Jake prepare for work. He was busy tying his tie, a routine I'd grown accustomed to over the years. I wanted to feel the excitement of the day ahead, but instead, a heaviness settled in my chest. Jake was always so focused on his job, leaving me with a lot of time to think, to wonder about what I was missing. As he kissed me goodbye, I forced a smile, trying to hide the growing emptiness inside me. "Have a great day, love," he said, his voice warm but distracted. I nodded, watching him leave, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving me alone in the quiet house. It was then that I heard a voice from the other side of the fence. "Hey there." It was Ryan, my neighbor. He had recently gone through a divorce, and I often found him outside, taking care of his garden or just sitting on his porch. We had struck up a casual friendship, sharing small talk and the occasional laugh. Today, however, there was something different in his tone. "Fancy a coffee?" he called out, looking over the fence with a casual smile that sent a strange flutter through my stomach. It wasn't the first time he'd invited me over, but today it felt more loaded, more intimate. I hesitated for a moment, thinking of the countless tasks I could tackle at home, but the thought of his easy charm was hard to resist. "Sure, why not?" I replied, trying to sound nonchalant, though I felt the thrill of anticipation creeping in. As I walked over to his house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary coffee date. Ryan opened the door, and the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee wrapped around me like a warm hug. The sunlight streamed in through the window, illuminating the room in a way that made it feel almost magical. Yet, there was a tension in the air, thick and palpable, as if we were both aware of the unspoken boundaries we were about to cross. "Come in," he said, his voice low and inviting. I stepped inside, my heart racing as I crossed the threshold. The moment the door closed behind me, I felt a rush of guilt mixed with an exhilarating sense of freedom. Ryan poured us both a cup, and as he handed me mine, our fingers brushed against each other. It was a simple touch, but it sent a jolt through me, igniting something I hadn't felt in so long. I caught his eye, and for a moment, we both just stood there, the air thick with possibilities. "Do you remember the first time we met?" he asked, a playful smile on his lips. "You nearly spilled your coffee all over me." I laughed, the sound sounding foreign yet delightful. Yes. I was so embarrassed. I thought you were going to explode at me. Not a chance, he chuckled, leaning a bit closer, as if sharing a secret. You were charmingly flustered. Charming? I'd say I looked like a total klutz, I replied, biting my lip, a nervous habit I hadn't noticed I was doing until now. Our conversations flowed effortlessly, drifting from light-hearted memories to deeper fears and dreams. I found myself sharing things I hadn't told anyone, not even Jake. Sometimes I feel like I'm just a shadow in my own life, I confessed, the words spilling out before I could stop myself. Ryan's gaze softened as he listened. You deserve to feel alive, to be seen, he said, his voice earnest. You're more than just someone's wife. His words struck a chord deep within me. I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. The warmth of our connection felt electric, and I could sense the walls around my heart beginning to crumble. Then, it happened. As I reached for the coffee cup again, our hands touched. It was a fleeting moment, but the world around us fell away. I looked up into his eyes, and everything else faded into the background. There was an undeniable spark, an unspoken understanding that we were both feeling something more than friendship. Wow, I breathed, feeling the heat rising in my cheeks. I didn't expect this. Neither did I, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't help it. In that moment, I felt as if we were standing on the edge of a precipice, the thrill of taking that leap pulling me closer to him. My heart raced as I grappled with the reality of what was happening. I was standing in my neighbor's house, feeling things I hadn't felt in years, and everything I knew about right and wrong seemed to blur. Maybe we should, I started, but my voice trailed off. I didn't know what I was suggesting, but there was a desire bubbling inside me that was impossible to ignore. Maybe we should, Ryan echoed, a knowing look in his eyes. And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew thick with unspoken words and the tantalizing scent of coffee. I had crossed a line, and I could feel the gravity of it pulling me further into unknown territory. The thrill of the moment was intoxicating, and I found myself yearning for more. The sun streamed through our kitchen window that morning in Seattle, casting a warm glow over everything. Jake was already bustling around, preparing for another long day at work. I stood by the counter, sipping my coffee, the rich aroma filling the air, a comfort I had grown used to. But beneath that comfort, something was stirring, a mix of excitement and anxiety. It was during one of those quiet mornings that I found myself drawn to Ryan, my neighbor. His recent divorce had turned him into a familiar figure in my life, one I never expected to become so close to. We would exchange pleasantries in the hallway or chat about the weather, but today, something felt different. As Jake kissed me goodbye, I noticed Ryan in his garden, tending to a patch of flowers. "Morning, Sarah," he called out, wiping his hands on his jeans. "How are you?" "Good, thanks. Just the usual," I replied, forcing a smile. But there was something in the way he looked at me that ignited a flicker of curiosity. "Would you like to join me for coffee later?" he asked, his tone casual. But there was an undercurrent that seemed to suggest more. "Sure, that sounds nice," I replied, my heart racing unexpectedly. I could feel the tension in my chest, a mix of intrigue and guilt. When I arrived at his house later, the atmosphere felt different. The sunlight poured in, illuminating the room and creating playful shadows on the walls. Ryan was standing in the kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. He looked relaxed, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions I was experiencing. "Make yourself at home," he said, gesturing to the comfortable sofa. I sat down, feeling the weight of the moment settle around us. As we talked, I found myself leaning in closer, drawn to him. The conversation flowed easily at first, but soon it delved into deeper topics. "I miss having someone to share things with," he said, his voice low. "It gets lonely after a while." I nodded, my heart beating faster. "I understand. Jake is always so busy with work." Ryan's eyes met mine, and in that moment, everything shifted. The playful banter turned into something more intense, charged with unspoken words. His hand brushed against my arm, and I felt a shiver run through me. "Do you ever feel like you're missing out on something?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. "Yes," I whispered, the admission slipping past my lips before I could stop it. The sun seemed to fade from the room, leaving only the two of us, locked in a moment that felt both forbidden and exhilarating. As his fingers lingered on my skin, I felt an undeniable pull towards him. Our eyes locked, and I could see the desire reflected back at me. It was intoxicating. The weight of my commitment to Jake felt lighter, almost negligible, as I leaned in closer, driven by an impulse I could hardly comprehend. "Ryan," I breathed, my heart racing. He didn't need to say anything. The air around us crackled with an electric tension, and I found myself leaning in even further, tilting my head to meet him. Our lips brushed together, a tentative connection that ignited a fire deep inside me. In that moment, everything else faded away. The guilt, the worry, the reality of my life with Jake. All that mattered was the warmth of Ryan's mouth on mine, the way his hand found its way to my waist, pulling me closer. I felt alive, as if I had been awakened from a long slumber. "Sarah," he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with longing. I pulled back slightly, searching his eyes for any sign of regret. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," he admitted, his breath warm against my skin. "But I can't stop thinking about you." My heart raced at his words. I was caught in a whirlwind of emotions: exhilaration, fear, and an overwhelming sense of desire. I was standing on the edge of something dangerously thrilling, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to fall. But with Ryan, I felt a connection I hadn't experienced in years. As the sun continued to shine through the window, illuminating our entwined hands, I realized that I was at a crossroads. I could feel the weight of my life with Jake pressing down on me, but the allure of this new path was so tempting. In that moment, I chose to embrace the thrill, surrendering to the unknown. The world outside faded, and all that remained was the warmth of Ryan's touch and the promise of something more. I walked back home, my heart racing, still feeling the warmth of Ryan's touch on my arm. Jake was sitting in the living room, his laptop open, and his attention fully captured by whatever was on the screen. He looked up briefly as I entered, offering me a distracted smile. I felt the weight of the world between us, though he had no idea. "Hey, how was your day?" he asked, his fingers typing away, not really looking at me. "It was good," I replied, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside. "Just the usual." I moved to the kitchen, needing to put some space between us to gather my thoughts. The aroma of coffee still lingered in my mind, the way Ryan's eyes sparkled when he laughed, how easy it felt to talk to him. I pushed the thoughts away, reminding myself of my life with Jake, the stability, the love we had built together. Yet, despite my efforts to focus, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was Ryan. I hesitated, my heart pounding. I picked it up, my fingers shaking slightly as I unlocked the screen. "Hey, I had a great time today. Can't stop thinking about it," the message read. Just those words sent a shiver down my spine. It was innocent enough, but I felt the heat creeping up my cheeks. I typed back quickly, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Me too. It was nice to connect." Nice? It was more than that, he replied, the tension building even through our texts. I bit my lip, a wave of guilt crashing over me. I shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't be feeling this way. But as the evening wore on, the messages kept coming. Each one was more loaded than the last, filled with innuendos and subtle hints of desire. With every ping of my phone, my heart raced in anticipation, a thrill coursing through me, both exciting and terrifying. "Are you free tomorrow?" Ryan texted. "Yes, I think so," I replied, my pulse quickening. I could almost hear his voice, smooth and inviting, as though he were right there next to me. "How about coffee again? Just us?" I could feel my resolve weakening. I glanced at Jake, still engrossed in his work, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in my heart. I was slipping away from him, and it scared me. Yet the thought of seeing Ryan made my stomach flutter in a way I hadn't experienced in years. "Sounds good," I typed back, my fingers trembling. The night dragged on, and sleep eluded me. Instead, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of Ryan. What was happening to me? I felt like I was betraying Jake, but there was something intoxicating about the connection I had with Ryan. It was as if he saw me in a way Jake hadn't in a long time. The next morning, I woke up with a start, the reality of my situation crashing down on me. I had a dream about Ryan, intense and vividly erotic. I could still feel the heat of his body against mine, the way he whispered my name. I felt breathless as I recalled the details, the rush of desire, and the guilt that followed. I quickly pushed the thoughts away, reminding myself of the life I had with Jake. I got up, trying to shake off the lingering feelings from my dream. I made breakfast, forcing myself to focus on the mundane tasks. Jake entered the kitchen, looking refreshed and ready for the day. "Smells great," he said, grabbing a slice of toast. I watched him, my heart heavy, knowing I was hiding a part of myself from him. "Thanks," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just trying to make a nice breakfast before you head off." He looked at me with a warm smile, the kind that used to make my heart flutter. But now, it felt different. I felt like I was two people, one with Jake and another with Ryan. The thought churned in my stomach, and I tried to ignore it. Later that day, as I sat in my living room, my phone buzzed again. It was Ryan, asking if I was ready for our coffee date. I felt a rush of excitement mixed with guilt. I was about to step into a world that felt intoxicating, yet dangerous. I met Ryan at his apartment, and the moment I stepped inside, the air shifted. There was an unspoken tension that crackled between us. We laughed and talked about everything and nothing, but underneath it all, I could feel the desire simmering just below the surface. As we reached for the same coffee mug, our hands brushed against each other, sending electricity through me. I looked up, and our eyes locked. There was a promise in that gaze, one that made my heart race, and my breath hitch. "There's something about you," Ryan said softly, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me. "I shouldn't be here," I admitted, the guilt creeping back in. "But you are," he said, stepping closer, his voice low and inviting, "and I can't help but want more of you." My heart pounded in my chest. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. But at what cost? I was standing on the edge, staring into the abyss of temptation and longing, caught between the life I'd built and the thrilling unknown. As I returned home, the reality of my actions hit me like a wave. Jake was still in his world, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was dancing on a tightrope, teetering dangerously close to falling. But the thrill of it all was consuming, and I found myself wanting to lean into that desire, even if it meant leaving everything I knew behind. The day started off just like any other, the sun shining brightly over Seattle. I could hear Jake bustling around the house, preparing for another long day at work. He was always so dedicated, buried in his laptop, his mind consumed by numbers and reports. I poured myself a cup of coffee, trying to shake off the unease that had started to creep into my mind. It was then that I spotted Ryan, my neighbor, in his yard. Since his divorce, he had taken to spending more time outside, tending to his garden. I waved, and he waved back, a hint of a smile on his face. We had become friends of sorts, sharing casual conversations that often lingered longer than I intended. "Hey, how's it going?" I called out, feeling a flutter of nerves as I approached the fence that separated our yards. "Not too bad. Just trying to keep up with these weeds," he replied, chuckling softly. "You should come over for coffee one of these days. I've got a new blend I think you'd love." The invitation hung in the air, more intimate than I had expected. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the house where Jake was oblivious to everything. "Sure, I'd love that," I found myself saying, my heart racing as I realized I was about to step into a world of uncertainty. As I crossed the threshold into Ryan's apartment later that week, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the air charged with something I couldn't quite place. Excitement mixed with guilt. Ryan greeted me with a warm smile, his blue eyes holding mine longer than necessary. "Make yourself at home," he said, gesturing to the small living room filled with sunlight streaming through the windows. I sat on the couch, acutely aware of the space between us. It felt like we were teetering on the edge of something dangerous and thrilling. "Nice place you have here," I complimented, trying to break the tension. "It's got a good vibe." "Thanks. It's been my sanctuary since the divorce," he said, moving closer, his presence overwhelming. "I've been meaning to ask, how are you holding up? I know Jake works a lot." I swallowed hard, the mention of Jake hitting me like a cold splash of water. "It's fine, really. Just busy. You know how it is." Ryan nodded, but his gaze was intense, almost searching. "You deserve more than just busy, you know. You should enjoy your life." I could feel the weight of his words, the unspoken implications hanging in the air. Our conversation drifted, moving from light topics to deeper, personal revelations. I found myself sharing my fears and regrets, things I had kept locked away. Ryan listened intently, his expression softening as I spoke. "I miss feeling alive," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if I've lost myself in all this." He reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm, sending a jolt through me. "You haven't lost yourself, not yet," he said, his voice low and soothing. "You're still here. You just need to rediscover that spark." In that moment, something shifted between us. Our hands lingered in the air as we both reached for the same coffee cup on the table, our fingers brushing together. The spark ignited, and I could feel the heat radiating between us. "Sorry," I murmured, pulling my hand back, but Ryan didn't let go. He held my gaze, his eyes darkening with desire. "It's okay," he said softly. "I don't mind." The air thickened, and I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to pull away, to remind myself of Jake and the life we had built together. But the pull towards Ryan was undeniable. I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, and the thrill of it was intoxicating. "Maybe we should just take it slow," I suggested, though my voice lacked conviction. Ryan chuckled lightly, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Slow isn't really my style, but I can try if that's what you want." His teasing tone made me smile, but my stomach churned with uncertainty. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow around the room, I recognized the weight of the choices I was making. I was standing on the edge of a precipice, and the fall could be devastating. "Can I ask you something?" Ryan said, his expression turning serious. "Of course," I replied, my pulse quickening. "If you could have anything you wanted right now, what would it be?" I hesitated, grappling with the truth that bubbled to the surface. I think I'd want to feel free," I admitted, the words spilling from my lips before I could stop them. Ryan's gaze turned heated, and he leaned in closer, the space between us disappearing. "Then let's be free together," he murmured, his voice laced with promise. In that moment, I felt a rush of excitement, the thrill of the unknown overwhelming my senses. I knew I was crossing a line, but the desire was stronger than the guilt. It felt so good to be seen, to be wanted. And as I looked into Ryan's eyes, that desire ignited a fire within me that I couldn't ignore, pulling me closer to a fate I couldn't yet comprehend. The day was bright and sunny in Seattle, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside me. Jake was getting ready for work, his footsteps echoing in the hallway as I sipped my coffee, trying to hide my thoughts behind the steam rising from my cup. He leaned over to kiss me goodbye, his lips brushing against mine. But I felt a disconnect, a gap that only seemed to widen with each passing day. "Have a great day at work," I said, forcing a smile. He nodded, his focus already shifting to the tasks waiting for him. After he left, I found myself standing by the window, glancing at Ryan's house next door. Ever since his divorce, our casual chats had become a routine. I could still remember the first time we spoke after he moved in. His smile was warm, and it brought me a sense of comfort I hadn't realized I was missing. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Ryan was just a friend, right? But that day, as I spotted him watering his garden, something pulled at me. I felt a nudge of curiosity mixed with an excitement I hadn't felt in a long time. I opened the door and walked over, my heart racing slightly. "Hey, Ryan," I called out, forcing my voice to sound casual. "Hey there," he replied, looking up with that charming grin. "How's your day going?" "Not bad, just the usual," I said, shrugging my shoulders. We exchanged small talk about the weather and the neighborhood, but there was an undeniable tension in the air, something unspoken hovering between us. "Would you like to come in for a coffee?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly. It felt more intimate than friendly, and I hesitated for a moment. "It's just coffee," he added, sensing my reluctance. "Sure, why not?" I found myself saying, even though a small voice in my head warned me against it. As I stepped inside his home, the door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing away the outside world and any sense of responsibility I had. The atmosphere was different, charged. I could feel the warmth radiating from the sun, filtering through the windows, casting playful shadows around us. We settled at the kitchen table, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the space. I noticed how close we were sitting, the table barely separating us, and my heart raced. Ryan poured my coffee, his hand brushing against mine as he handed me the cup. I felt a spark, an electric jolt that made my skin tingle. "So, how have you been holding up?" he asked, genuine concern etched on his face. "Oh, just keeping busy. Jake's been working a lot," I replied, the mention of my husband making my stomach twist. I stared into my coffee, avoiding Ryan's gaze as guilt washed over me. "That must be tough," he said softly. "I know how that feels. Being alone can really get to you." His voice was low, and when I finally looked up, his eyes held a depth that made my breath hitch. "Yeah, it can," I admitted, feeling a connection growing between us, a bond that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. As we talked, the conversation drifted from mundane topics to more personal ones. I found myself sharing secrets I had never told anyone, my fears and dreams spilling out with surprising ease. Ryan listened intently, his eyes never leaving mine, and each time I caught his gaze, I felt the space between us shrink further. Then it happened. Our hands reached for the same coffee cup at the same moment. The world around us faded, and all I could focus on was the warmth of his skin against mine. I felt a rush of desire, an overwhelming impulse that made my heart race wildly. "Sorry," I murmured, pulling my hand back, but Ryan didn't let go. Instead, he held my gaze, and in that moment, everything shifted. The tension hung thick in the air, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. "Don't be sorry," he whispered, his voice low and inviting. The way he looked at me ignited something deep within, a yearning I hadn't acknowledged until now. I leaned closer, drawn in by an invisible force, my breath hitching in my throat. "Ryan," I started, but the words got lost somewhere between my mind and my heart. I could see the question in his eyes, the hope mingled with a hint of uncertainty. "Just let it happen," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. And in that moment, it felt like all the walls I had built around myself were crumbling down. My heart screamed for me to give in, to take that leap into the unknown. But then, a flash of reality hit me. Jake, my life, the promise I made to him. I pulled back slightly, panic rising in my chest. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice shaky and uncertain. Ryan's expression shifted, a mixture of understanding and frustration. "I don't know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair, "but I can't help how I feel about you." The truth hung heavy between us, and I struggled to find my footing in this new, chaotic reality. The desire was intoxicating, but the weight of guilt threatened to suffocate me. I was teetering on the edge, and I had no idea what the next step would cost me. I could feel the thrill of the unknown calling me, yet the thought of Jake loomed large, an anchor holding me back. In that moment, I realized I was standing at a crossroads, with two paths stretching out before me. One led back to the life I had known, filled with stability but devoid of passion. The other beckoned with the promise of something wild and thrilling, something that ignited a fire within me. And as I looked into Ryan's eyes, I knew I was about to make a choice that could change everything. The sun poured through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over everything in sight. I stood at the counter, watching as Jake hurriedly packed his briefcase for work. His brow was furrowed in concentration, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of longing for the kind of attention we used to share. "Are you ready for your meeting today?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful. "Yeah, just need to grab my files," he replied, barely looking up. I could hear the urgency in his voice, and it reminded me of how busy he always was. There was a time when we would enjoy our mornings together, sipping coffee and laughing about the little things. Now, it felt more like we were passing ships in the night. After Jake left, I found myself wandering outside to the small patio that separated our homes. That's when I saw Ryan, my neighbor, standing on his porch, sipping a cup of coffee. He had been through a rough divorce recently, and our casual chats had turned into a comforting routine. "Morning, Ryan," I called out, trying to shake off the loneliness that clung to me. "Good morning. Care to join me for a coffee?" he replied, with a smile that lit up his face. I hesitated for a moment, the invitation feeling heavier than it should have. "Sure, why not?" I said, forcing a smile as I walked over. We settled into his living room, the sunlight streaming through the big windows, creating an inviting atmosphere. As we talked, I felt a shift in the air, an undeniable tension that I had never noticed before. "I've been meaning to ask you," Ryan said, leaning a little closer. "Would you like to come over more often? I could use some company." His tone had a hint of something more intimate, and my heart raced in response. "Yeah, I'd like that," I replied, surprised by my own eagerness. As I crossed the threshold into his home, a wave of guilt washed over me, but it was quickly overshadowed by an electric thrill. We chatted about everything and nothing, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper. I found myself revealing secrets I had kept buried. "Sometimes I feel so alone," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan nodded, his gaze locked onto mine, as if he understood the weight of my words. "I get that. It's tough to connect sometimes," he said softly. And in that moment, our hands brushed against each other as we reached for the same cup of coffee. The touch sent shivers down my spine, igniting a spark I hadn't felt in years. I pulled back slightly, aware of the line we were crossing, but it was too late. The air around us thickened, charged with an unspoken desire. I could see it in Ryan's eyes, the promise of something forbidden. I bit my lip, feeling the pull between us grow stronger by the second. "You know," Ryan said, his voice low, "it's okay to want more than what you have." I felt my heart race at his words, the truth behind them hitting me hard. What did I want? I was married, yet here I was, sitting with a man who understood me in ways Jake no longer did. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the shadows in the room deepened, and with it, the tension between us. I could feel Ryan's gaze on me, a mixture of longing and caution. I had never been in this position before, and the thrill of it was intoxicating. "Do you ever think about what it would be like to just let go?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt a rush of heat rise to my cheeks, my mind racing with possibilities I had never dared to entertain. I wanted to say yes, to explore that freedom, but the thought of Jake loomed large in my mind. I shook my head, half in denial and half in desperation. "I shouldn't be here," I breathed. But even as I said it, a part of me wished to stay, to lean into the connection that was growing between us. Ryan reached out, brushing my arm lightly with his fingers. My breath hitched at the contact, and I found myself leaning closer, drawn in by an irresistible force. "Sometimes we need to break free to truly live," he murmured, his eyes searching mine for understanding. I could feel the weight of my choices pressing down on me. The thrill of being with Ryan was intoxicating, but guilt gnawed at me. Still, as I sat there, feeling the warmth of his presence, I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to give in to that desire. The moment stretched on, an eternity hanging between us, and I knew I was standing on the precipice of something life-altering. My heart raced, torn between the safety of my life with Jake and the wild excitement that Ryan promised. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts, but all I could think about was the heat radiating from Ryan and the uncharted territory that lay ahead. The sun shone brightly over Seattle that morning, casting a warm glow through the kitchen window. I stood at the counter, watching Jake as he prepared for another long day at work. He didn't notice me, lost in his world of spreadsheets and meetings, his phone buzzing incessantly. I sighed, stirring my coffee absent-mindedly, thinking about how many times I had done this routine. Just as Jake grabbed his briefcase, I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Ryan, my neighbor, standing there with his charming smile. He had recently gone through a divorce, and our casual chats had become a small escape for both of us. "Hey, I was just about to make some coffee. Want to join me?" His eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. Sure," I replied, glancing back at Jake, who was now on his way out the door. I quickly assured him I'd be fine and stepped outside, closing the door behind me. As I walked towards Ryan's apartment, a strange mix of excitement and guilt bubbled inside me. I had never thought of Ryan in any way other than a friend, but lately, our conversations had shifted. I couldn't shake the feeling that our connection was deepening. Ryan's apartment was just as I remembered, filled with books, art, and an inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. "I hope you like it black," he said, pouring us each a cup. I laughed softly. "I do, just like my life, no sugar added." We settled on the couch, and the atmosphere felt charged, heavier than usual. I tried to focus on the coffee, but Ryan's gaze lingered on me, unsettling, yet thrilling. "You look different today. Is it the sunshine?" he asked, leaning closer. "Maybe it's just a change of scenery," I said, my heart racing as I felt the warmth of his body beside mine. The conversation flowed easily, moving from light-hearted jokes to deeper subjects. We shared our fears and dreams, things I never discussed with anyone else. It felt liberating, and the more we talked, the more I felt a pull towards him. Then, it happened. Our hands brushed against each other as we reached for the same cup. A jolt of electricity shot through me, and I looked into his eyes, searching for answers. They were dark and intense, filled with unspoken desires. "I shouldn't be here," I whispered, feeling a weight of shame. "Why not?" he replied, his voice low and inviting. "We're just two people enjoying each other's company." "But I'm married," I stammered, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "Are you happy?" Ryan's question hung in the air, heavy with implications. I don't know," I admitted, the truth spilling from my lips. The tension thickened around us, and before I could process what I was doing, I leaned in closer, drawn by something I couldn't resist. Our lips met softly at first, a tentative exploration. But as the kiss deepened, I felt the world around us fade away, leaving only the two of us entwined in a moment of perfect bliss. Reality crashed back as I pulled away, my heart pounding. "Oh God, what have I done?" Ryan's expression was a mix of satisfaction and concern. "You needed that, didn't you?" I didn't know how to respond. Shame washed over me, but there was also a thrill that was hard to ignore. I had crossed a line, and yet it felt so alive. I could hardly think straight as I left Ryan's apartment, my mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. When I got home, Jake was still at his laptop, oblivious to the storm brewing within me. I tried to act normal, but every time he looked at me, I felt the guilt clawing at my insides. "Everything okay?" he asked, glancing up from his screen. "Yeah, just a long day," I replied, forcing a smile that felt more like a mask. As the evening wore on, I found myself reaching for my phone, hesitating before sending a message to Ryan. My heart raced as I typed, "Can we talk again soon?" The thrill of secrecy was intoxicating, but it was tainted with guilt. I didn't want to hurt Jake, but something about Ryan pulled me in. I felt trapped between two worlds, a dangerous dance of desire and responsibility. The days that followed became a blur of stolen moments and secret messages. Each time I met Ryan, I felt a mix of exhilaration and dread. Our connection grew deeper, but so did the weight of my deception. I was playing a role, pretending everything was fine at home while my heart belonged somewhere else. Every time I saw Jake's trusting smile, it twisted the knife of my guilt deeper. I was living a lie, and yet, the temptation to see Ryan was too strong to resist. It was becoming a habit, one I couldn't break. I was addicted to the thrill, to the way Ryan made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I knew I was walking a tightrope, balancing my marriage and this reckless new flame. But every time I thought about stepping back, the pull of Ryan's magnetic energy drew me in again. It was a game I was terrified to play, yet I couldn't stop myself. I stood by the kitchen window, the sunlight pouring into our home, illuminating the mundane chaos of breakfast. Jake was bustling around, getting ready for work, his mind already absorbed in the tasks awaiting him at the office. He didn't notice how my thoughts drifted away from our routine. They wandered to Ryan, my neighbor. Ever since his divorce, Ryan had become a fixture in my life, a confidant during the long evenings when Jake wasn't around. "Are you ready for another day of meetings?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful as I poured Jake another cup of coffee. He nodded, distracted, his eyes glued to his laptop. "Yeah, just the usual. I'll be home late again. Can you manage dinner by yourself?" "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. But my heart sank a little, knowing I would be alone again, with nothing but the quiet of the house and the echoes of my thoughts. After Jake left, I found myself glancing out the window towards Ryan's apartment. He had texted me earlier, inviting me over for coffee. It was a casual invitation, but there was something in his tone that made my skin tingle with anticipation. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, the cool air hitting my face as I walked across the shared courtyard. Ryan opened the door with a warm smile, his eyes sparkling with something I couldn't quite place. "Hey, come in," he said, stepping aside. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was the line I was crossing, and deep down, I knew it. "Thanks for inviting me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course, it's nice to have company," he replied, his gaze lingering on me a moment longer than necessary. The atmosphere in the room shifted, a pulsing energy crackling between us. We settled on the couch, and as he poured the coffee, I watched him, captivated by the way he moved. "So, how have you been?" he asked, his voice low and inviting. "Busy. You know how it is," I said, shrugging. But the truth was, I felt more isolated than ever. Jake was absorbed in his work, and our conversations had become routine, devoid of the spark that once lit our relationship. Ryan leaned in slightly, his expression earnest. "You can talk to me about anything, you know. I'm here for you." A part of me wanted to share everything, to spill my heart out and reveal the cracks in my marriage. But another part hesitated, knowing how dangerous that path could be. Instead, I smiled weakly. "I appreciate that, really. It's just, things have felt a bit off lately." "I get it," he said, his eyes searching mine. "Sometimes it helps to have someone to talk to." That was when our hands brushed against each other as we reached for the same cup of coffee. The touch sent a jolt through me, igniting a warmth that spread from my fingertips to my core. I could feel the tension thickening the air, the unspoken words hanging between us. "Sorry," I mumbled, pulling my hand back, but Ryan didn't move away. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's okay. I like being close to you." My breath caught in my throat. I knew I should pull away, that I should remind myself of Jake waiting for me at home, but the way Ryan looked at me made it hard to think. His gaze was intense, filled with something I had longed for, but hadn't realized until that moment. "Ryan?" I started, my heart racing, but he reached out, gently placing his hand on my arm, and I felt a thrill of electricity at his touch. "Just breathe," he said softly, his thumb brushing over my skin. The world outside faded, and all I could focus on was him. I felt drawn to him, an undeniable pull that made it impossible to resist. I leaned in, and our lips met in a tentative kiss, soft and exploring at first, but as the kiss deepened, I felt a rush of passion that took my breath away. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. "What are we doing?" I whispered, the weight of guilt crashing down on me. "I don't know," he admitted, his forehead resting against mine. "But it feels right, doesn't it?" "Yes, but..." I hesitated, reality creeping back in. I imagined Jake, working late, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions that was now swirling in my chest. "I shouldn't be here," I murmured, pulling back slightly. "Maybe not," Ryan replied, his eyes searching mine. "But you are." and I can't pretend that I don't want this." The tension hung in the air, heavy and intoxicating. I knew I was playing with fire, but the thrill of being wanted, of being alive, was too tempting to ignore. The guilt faded into the background, overshadowed by the desire that flared between us. As I left Ryan's apartment later that day, I felt a mix of exhilaration and dread. I had crossed a line, and I knew there was no turning back. What had started as a simple coffee invitation had transformed into something so much more dangerous, something that could shatter my carefully constructed life with Jake. And yet, as I walked home, I couldn't help but feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I woke up to the sun streaming through the window, casting a warm glow across the bedroom. Jake was already up, his focus on the laptop in front of him. I could hear the gentle tapping of his fingers on the keyboard and the faint hum of a podcast playing in the background. I lay there for a moment, taking in the softness of the sheets and the familiar comfort of our home. But today, something felt different. An undercurrent of tension buzzed beneath the surface of my thoughts. After Jake left for work, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. As I strolled through the neighborhood, I spotted Ryan, my neighbor, tending to his garden. Ever since his divorce, we had struck up a friendship, sharing casual conversations over the fence that separated our yards. Today, however, I felt a strange pull towards him, something I couldn't quite place. "Hey, Ryan," I called out, forcing a smile. "Morning. Fancy seeing you out and about," he replied, brushing dirt off his hands. "How have you been?" "Busy with work and keeping up with everything at home," I said, my voice trailing off. The afternoon sun highlighted his features, making him look more handsome than I remembered. "Want to come over for a coffee? I could use the company," Ryan suggested, a hint of something deeper lurking in his tone. I hesitated, my heart racing at the thought of being alone with him. "Sure, that sounds nice." As I stepped into his house, the air shifted. It was as if the world outside faded away. The soft scent of fresh coffee mixed with something more intoxicating, something that sent a thrill through me. Ryan moved to pour us each a cup, and I took a moment to glance around. His home felt inviting, yet there was an undertone of intimacy that made my heart race. "Here you go," he said, handing me a steaming mug. Our fingers brushed against each other, and for a moment, I felt a spark that caught me off guard. "Thanks," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We settled into his living room, the sunlight pouring through the windows, creating a warm and inviting atmosphere. "So, how's life treating you?" he asked, leaning slightly closer, his eyes locked onto mine. I could feel the tension building, an unspoken connection between us that was impossible to ignore. "It's fine, I guess," I said, suddenly aware of how often I had to lie about my happiness. "Jake's been so busy with work lately. Sometimes I feel like I'm just floating through my days." "I get that. It's hard when you feel alone, even when you're with someone," he replied, his voice low and filled with understanding. I looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "Yeah, exactly. It's like I'm just a part of his routine." Ryan nodded, his gaze intense. "You deserve more than that. You deserve someone who sees you." The way he spoke made my heart race. There was a vulnerability in his words that resonated with me. I felt my breath catch in my throat as our conversation deepened, revealing secrets and fears I hadn't shared with anyone else. And then, it happened. Our hands reached for the same coffee cup, and the moment our fingers touched, a jolt of electricity shot through me. I could feel my pulse quicken, a mix of excitement and guilt washing over me. "Sorry," I said, pulling my hand back, but Ryan didn't move away. Instead, he held my gaze, and I could see a flicker of something more, something that made my skin tingle. "Don't be," he replied softly, his voice a mere whisper. Sometimes, it's better not to apologize for what we feel. That single statement hung in the air, thick with unspoken promises. I could feel the heat radiating between us, a magnetic pull that drew me closer. Without even thinking, I leaned in slightly, caught in the moment. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of us in this charged space. I knew I should pull back, remind myself of Jake, of the life I had built with him. But the desire was overwhelming, drowning out the voice of reason. Ryan's eyes flickered down to my lips, and in that moment, I was lost. I wanted to taste the sweetness of what could be, to explore this connection that had been building between us. As if sensing my thoughts, Ryan shifted closer, his breath mingling with mine. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and filled with concern. I nodded, unable to find my voice. The desire swelled within me, drowning out the lingering thoughts of guilt and loyalty. I could feel the heat of his body, the way his presence enveloped me, and it was intoxicating. "Just thinking," I finally managed to say, though I knew I was lying. My heart raced as I contemplated what I was about to do, what it would mean for everything I had known. "Do you want to keep thinking, or do you want to feel?" he asked, his eyes boring into mine, inviting me to cross the line. Before I could answer, the urge to be with him surged through me. I found myself leaning in, my lips brushing against his. The kiss ignited something deep within me, a fire I hadn't realized was there. It felt wrong, yet so incredibly right all at once. As we pulled away, breathless and wide-eyed, I couldn't help but think of Jake, of the life I was leaving behind with each passing moment. But as I looked into Ryan's eyes, filled with promise and desire, I felt the weight of my choices slipping away. There was no turning back now. I was in too deep, and I couldn't hide from the truth any longer.